So I can say from firsthand experience how powerful the work of DWN is in communities all over the country. And also a member, let's get a show of hands of current and future members of the Silky Shah fan club. All right, so with that, I am so excited to get to talk with you a little bit, Silky, about the book, and have you tell us what we need to do to win all the things going forward. So I'm assuming we will cover that in 35 minutes. If you have questions, we will get to questions, hopefully at the end. So keep them forming, percolating. We'll have about 10 minutes afterwards. So Silky, why don't we get started? We just heard a little bit about where you're from. Would love for you to share a little bit about growing up in Texas and how that informed your work today, and what you saw in Texas that can help us understand both the immigrant detention system and also the prison industrial complex in the United States.
Hi, everyone. Before we go there, I just thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to be doing this here, seeing so many friends, comrades, colleagues, so many people who've shaped this work for so many years and have built this beautiful organization that we've done this alongside each other, and for everyone for donating. Just so much gratitude to you. We're really, really, truly. It's as you know, it's a really, really tough time for our work, and so literally every penny, dollar counts. And I was feeling emotional. I was like, wow, it's just so beautiful to have this kind of support. So thank you so much. So your question, I grew up in Texas. Maybe there are some other Texans in the house. Yeah, so I mean, in so many ways, I was born and raised in Houston, which is one of, I think maybe Jersey City rivals it, but one of the most diverse places in the whole entire country. And it, growing up in a community that was sort of booming and growing with more and more immigrant community, both in terms of the South Asian community I'm a part of, but all the schools I went to were majority Latine. My very close friend in high school was undocumented. All that stuff was just super present for me. And then I was a student at the University of Texas at Austin, and it was the period of time when, there's a lot of student activism. It was after the WTO protests and other things were happening. But then 9/11 happened whenever I was in college, and it kind of just opened the world of wow, what actually is happening? And, both in terms of the war on terror abroad and going into the Iraq war, but also the domestic war on terror, which organizing around that issue in Texas, we started to see essentially another prison boom happening. So when I was there, I took on a job with a group called Grassroots Leadership, and we were fighting private prisons on the national level, but then all of a sudden there was all these speculative facilities being popped up. There was this sort of, if you build it, they will come mentality. And the US government was soliciting new facilities for detention. So everything we were fighting was, we were criminal justice advocates, that's how or organizers, but every single prison we were fighting had immigrants in it. And so there was no real separation. And I think so much of what I'm trying to do with this book is say, actually, we are, the title is Unbuild Walls, and I say it's about unbuilding, of course, prison, detention center, jail walls, unbuilding border walls, but I think it's also, for me, so much about unbuilding those walls between our movement for social change, because what I experienced in Texas was that actually all these things are so interconnected, and now I think there's a lot more awareness about that than there was before, but yeah, I think there's no question that that period of time really shaped my understanding of the work.
So one of the things that is amazing in your book is that you actually, I said when we were talking, I said, let's go over the overview you give us of the last 30 years. But really, Silky also covers like the past 100 years if you want to get into
well, sort of, yeah.
some of the things that are important to know about how our immigration system has developed, the norms that we have about who's allowed to be here and why and all of that. But one of the things that I thought was so insightful was the way that you helped connect the dots between decisions across administrations. So often with everything related to immigration, we end up missing the threads that connect Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. And so I think it would be really helpful as we get into talking about abolition and what that looks like and talking about some of the amazing organizing that DWN has been supporting and involved in to share a little bit about what are some of those key decision points that have been made over the past few decades over multiple administrations with all sorts of appointed and elected leaders that have really helped shape both the detention and prison system that we are grappling with in the current moment.
Yeah, well, I'll try to do that in 5 minutes. It's wild to think about because I think right now we're in such a heightened moment around the criminalization of immigrants and the sort of good immigrant versus bad immigrant frame or the old immigrant versus new immigrant frame, but it's sort of essentially been this way for a really long time and operated in different ways over periods of time. And you know, I could go back a long time, but I'll go back to the 90s at the very least because I do think that's a really important time. Detention Watch Network was actually founded in 1997 by a group of people who were really concerned about what was happening in the detention system and seeing basically from 1996 when 2 really draconian immigration bills were passed. In the following year, the detention system essentially doubled. You started to see by 1998, like, at any given time, 15,000 or more people in detention, and it's since grown. Right now, it's 37, 38,000. And, you know, it was this sort of merger of the criminal legal system and immigration system happening at that time in response to a lot of different things, but very particularly rising tough on crime policies since the 80s, the war on drugs, and in fact, a lot of really harsh measures around mandatory detention and sort of the scope of who could be like denied due process essentially happened through legislation related to the war on drugs in the 80s. And so in the 90s, what we saw in this sort of like national security frameworks after the Oklahoma City bombing, it's also a time when, you know, it's the rise of neoliberalism. You have tough on crime policies, things like the crime bill. And all of those things sort of culminate. And in 1996, you have 2 really harsh bills that basically completely changed the paradigm from, you know, resident versus non-resident. So if you were a green card holder, you had some sort of status, like you wouldn't necessarily be subject to mandatory detention if you had a certain crime. But after this point, it was citizen versus non-citizen, and we see that sort of heightening, like becoming more and more people being funneled into the detention system. So overnight, you had people who had been in the country for 20 years being fast-tracked to deportation because of a past crime. And that was the impetus for Detention Watch Network being founded. And then after 9/11, and this sort of goes back to the story about the work I was doing in Texas, you know, we really understand the war on terror as a sort of investment in capital and resources into U.S. militarism abroad, which of course is continuing in so many ways, in devastating ways, and it's had generational impacts. But the domestic war on terror often operated through the criminal legal system. So that prison I was fighting in Laredo, Texas, was actually a U.S. Marshals facility, and the reason why they were building it is because there was more people being targeted for prosecution. So there's these sort of, you know, this idea that people who are in immigration detention are there administratively, not necessarily serving a sentence for a crime. Maybe they have a past crime, but you also have this sort of parallel system of immigrants being prosecuted for entering the country without documentation, getting 6 months in jail, or sometimes if they did it twice or they had other crimes, it could be 2 years, it could be 5 years, it could be up to 20 years. And you just saw this snowballing. And by 2004, immigration crimes become the #1 crime in the federal courts. So you just see this incredible snowballing. We're fighting these prisons on the border, but more and more people are being funneled in. And so that's what really, that was the period of time I came into the work. And this is really what we see during the Bush years. This program called Operation Streamline that prosecuted people en masse in these really, really horrible, horrific ways without any due process, a total farce of due process. And then you get, the system is growing. It's a really intense moment. You have things, really harsh policy in 2005 and detentions growing and growing and growing. And then the Obama administration comes in. And often I have a whole chapter dedicated to the Obama administration, largely to process it. But, in so many ways, I had already, I'd connected with groups like Critical Resistance. I had already kind of came to this perspective on abolition. I was like, yeah, prisons are violence. I don't believe in prisons. But then it was under the Obama years that I started to really understand why abolition was so, so essential to our strategy and having a real lens and a guide for our work. Because at the time, I had come in starting working at Detention Watch Network in March of 2009, and we were like, there was opportunity because the Obama administration was like, we're going to reform the detention system. And their response was, well, a lot of what we were saying is look, the conditions are so bad, people are dying in detention, there should be alternatives, we need people to be released on alternatives, which essentially at the time was often ankle monitors, GPS monitoring. And instead of actually reducing the system, what we saw is our push for conditions lead to them creating nicer facilities that were ostensibly in this idea because people in detention aren't serving a sentence for the crime, so they ostensibly should be in nicer conditions. And so we saw new facilities like the Karnes County Detention Center, which eventually became a family detention center under Obama, and they had resident advisor and softer materials, so these nicer cages essentially. And it started expanding, and actually part of what happened was that because the Obama administration wanted to make the system better, they started working more with private prison companies because the private prison companies were ready to play ball. So they were like, yeah, we'll make these nicer conditions for you. And so early on in Obama, there was less than 50% of detention beds operated by private prison companies. By the end of his administration, it's over 70%. So we see that sort of growth of neoliberalism in that context, which has only gone up more and more and more. And then, of course, with alternatives to detention, as many people in this room work on and know, instead of actually releasing people, it just meant people who would otherwise never been detained actually ended up on an ankle monitor. So it served to expand the system and grow it even more. And in addition, those prosecutions I was talking about went up and up and up, and Operation Streamline was extended to more districts on the border. So this is the system that's handed over to Trump. And a lot of the narrative under Obama was that good immigrant versus bad immigrant narrative, and really commandeering the criminal legal system to target more and more people. And I think that's how we got to the place where Obama was referred to as deporter in chief. And that's a system that's handed over to Trump. And then all those things become that much more heightened. And I think folks have some sense of what's happened since then. But I do really believe, one of the things that was so important about that shift from Obama to Trump is that actually a lot of the folks in this room, a lot of people in the movement were able to break through some of that good versus bad immigrant frame and actually push for better policy. And even prior to that, with the incredible work of the immigrant youth movement, these systems are responding to movement as well. And so actually through that time during the Obama years, organizers, family members had to sort of understand the criminal legal system better. There was also the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course the immigrant youth movement. And those things led to things like deferred action for childhood arrivals, temporary protected status, and sanctuary policy that actually reduced the number of deportations in the U.S. So, I think that, just to say, I think it's hard right now. This is a really tough time, but I think those years are both instructive for why reforms don't actually work, and also how we can sort of, by understanding these systems as one, as intertwined, we actually have the ability to throw a wrench more and more in the system.
And we're going to talk in a minute about at least one campaign example, right, of how some of that organizing happened. I love, Silky, that you uplifted that we respond to conditions and also conditions respond to us. So how we organize actually has a big impact on then what are the systems and decision makers' actions and all of that then we kind of take into account with our strategizing. Something that you spoke about a little bit, but I wonder if we could just put a finer point on before we talk about the campaign is the particular narrative around criminalization when we get into good immigrants, bad immigrants. I know for me personally, and I probably will date myself a little bit here, a very big politicizing moment for me was the 2006 May 1st marches. And people may remember, or if you weren't there, you maybe have seen pictures, millions of people around the country in the streets demanding a pathway to citizenship for undocumented people in our communities. The signs you saw over and over again were, "We are not criminals." And so thinking about where the movement was at that time, that being so central to the demand that we were uplifting as a movement was not just that we are good, but that we are not criminals. And I wonder, Silky, if you could just share a little bit more about like the narrative of criminality and how being so focused on that as a way to position ourselves and what we deserve has undermined our ability to actually make progress. And then, yes, let's talk more about how this has actually played out, especially when we have learned from those mistakes. But it just is something that I don't remember, honestly, when you're talking about the 80s, 90s, the idea that the debate was actually about being a criminal or if immigration is a crime or not is something that has just become so embedded in how we think about this, even as people organizing like for our communities. I think it would be so great to hear a little more about what you see as like the damage done specifically by the reliance on this frame around criminality.
Yeah, I mean, going back to that Obama moment, in so many ways, the Obama administration, like, their strategy to fix the system was to focus on those immigrants who commit crimes and really reinforce the idea that immigration is a public safety issue, which it's not. Like, immigration is about family, it's about labor and work, it's about seeking refuge. It's not actually about public safety, but this lie of it being about public safety and national security is constantly told to us. And in many ways, you know, it wasn't just the Obama administration that did this. It was also the mainstream parts of the immigrant rights movement, especially lobbyists here in DC, that reinforced this frame over and over again in order to get comprehensive immigration reform. And comprehensive immigration reform, the idea is, you know, we're going to get something good, usually legalization for a large portion of the undocumented population, up to 11 million. Often it didn't include that whole population, for trade-offs on pretty bad stuff, mostly criminalization of communities and border militarization. And so you saw the trade-off become that much more intense over time. And so, you know, you had the fights in 2007, and of course, like, what was amazing is that the immigrant youth, like, broke off from this and they're like, no, we're going to do our own thing, like, screw the CIR. But you also, like, by 2013, this fight became, you know, so extreme that there was actually this injection of $46 billion border, like, amendment called the Corker-Hobart Amendment, and everyone just sort of accepted it. It was so wild. Not everyone. Some of us didn't, but it was so wild. And I think part of it is that in so many ways that sort of the DC lobbyist space, or just in general, that sort of we are not criminals, we are workers frame really played into the, like, politics of respectability. Like, immigrants are productive and they're relatively innocent and they're patriotic and they're workers and they're all these good things. And in fact, I imagine a lot of people have heard this summer, immigrants commit less crimes than US citizens, and without any recognition of the problems with the criminal legal system or the anti-black racism that actually underlies such comparisons, there's this constant thing that reinforces this idea that immigration should be about crime. And unfortunately, what we've seen over time is this constant push for comprehensive immigration reform has traded off more and more and more and more, that by the time we got to last fall, whenever there was a push for more funding for the border, and also as to some degree to get more money for the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel and Gaza. And for so long, the trade-off was, okay, we're going to get legalization, and we're fine with any border militarization or this criminalization or the carve-outs or all of that. But in this scenario, you weren't even getting legalization. You were just in a place where actually the push, which is now the border bill that's constantly being talked about, was for anything. The trade-off on border became about anything, and it just gave more and more space for the Republicans to move in that narrative. And so I think part of the harm is that in many ways the fight really focused on this like old immigrant, the immigrant that's been here for a long time, versus the new immigrant, and reinforcing that both around like criminalization and all the other things only serves to that border militarization only serves to dehumanize people even more. We have more detention, we have more quote unquote chaos at the border, et cetera. And that just dehumanizes immigrants more and more and more, and it makes it harder for us to win legalization. It actually has made it that much harder. And so I think we really have to break from that frame in order to get to a place actually where we're fighting for everyone, and also not pitting working class communities of color against each other by saying things like immigrants are better than everyone else. Like, that doesn't help us. We have to actually really commit to racial justice in the collective, and that is so critical.
Yeah. Okay. So, and I think part of some of the examples of the harm that you name in the book, you talk specifically about with border militarization, we saw not only the impact on border communities generally, but certainly the extreme violence, extreme and perhaps really unmitigated violence that we saw with Haitian migrants specifically, so the treatment of black immigrants in particular. The way that the local police infrastructure has been commandeered, and we have this infrastructure in place now that actually facilitates the arrest and deportation at a rate that we didn't have before. We had this frame, not just the narrative, but the infrastructure to cement it in a way that it really is not just about one administration or the other, but it's really like the system that we're operating in all the time. So there is some amazing organizing that you highlight in the book. I think all of these campaigns deserve their own hour panel to talk about, but I would love for you to share a little bit about the work to end detention in New Jersey and just some of the lessons to help us understand. Abolition can sound like a very vague academic, what would that even mean, what could that look like, demand, and I would love for you to share a little bit about that campaign in particular and how abolition came to actually advance that campaign's goals in the end.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the campaigns that inspires me the most. There's a lot of campaigns I write about in the book, but I think what was so remarkable about this one is that it really shifted movement on the ground. And so there, I was living in New York at the time, and we had actually in 2012 pushed to close some detention centers. One of them was the Hudson County Jail, or end a contract at the Hudson County Jail in New Jersey. And it became a little bit contentious because one of the things about the facility being there was a lot of New Yorkers who were held there, and people were like, well, this is close to us, and we, have access, and we have attorneys who can provide services. We don't want to end the contract at this jail because that could mean people will get transferred. And it became sort of contentious, and then many years later, it actually became even much more contentious because the city of New York actually started funding legal representation for New Yorkers who were detained at the Hudson County Jail, which is a remarkable win. But at the same time, I mean, Hudson was a horrible facility. It is a horrible facility. It still exists. But, and, there had been deaths in the facility. There was, no real outdoor recreation. The conditions were terrible. There was abuse. And many people were actually pushing to shut it down. And in 2018, the Hudson County freeholders said, okay, we're going to shut it down. And a whole bunch of legal service providers came out and said, well, actually, we don't want you to shut down this facility because, we're down with abolish ICE, but we don't want you to shut down this facilities because we can keep our services intact. And it's something that happens often in jail fights where there's this framework that James Kilgore has offered called carceral humanism, where people see jails as sites of social service provision. So, people can go through drug treatment. People can get mental health services. People can get legal representation here. And therefore, that becomes a reason to keep a jail open. And it was, we don't have a lot of time, but there's a lot to say about this. I encourage folks, if you have time, to read this section of the book. But what was remarkable is actually because of the heightened moment around 2020, actually a lot more folks kind of came on board for the fight to close this facility. And we had done some work with Immigrant Legal Resource Center to show that when you have a facility in a community, it actually means more people are detained. Just by having detention nearby, more people are targeted because ICE is looking for people to fill beds. And after, just an incredible amount of organizing, incredible escalation by people on the ground, not only did they eventually get to a place where they got the freeholders to, because they decided to extend the contract 10 years, but they changed their mind because the organizers became such a nuisance. But also, the legal service providers eventually started to come on board because they actually understood what was happening better. So I think it's an important fight because it shows that often there are real tensions between lawyers and organizers, but once people start working together, really understanding the harms of the system, they were able to come to a different place. And continues to be a fight in New Jersey to end detention completely, but several facilities are no longer in use in that state, largely because of the organizing on the ground and the organizing of people inside. And a lot of this is on one of the slides, but New Jersey's just one example. Across the country, organizers, advocates, people have passed laws to end detention. Many facilities have shut down. We've actually pressured the federal government to shut down facilities or end contracts. And over 25 facilities are no longer in use because of those organizing campaigns, which is really
Okay, so
there's a mic.
There's a giant. Well, I think. Yeah. Do we have a mic? I have a mic. Sorry. Okay, so while we're transitioning to having time for a couple questions, I just want to acknowledge what Silky was just sharing about how the landscape has shifted despite really substantial obstacles. I really want to uplift, DWN has played such a critical role in that national landscape shifting. Being able to move from an organizing context that was just about how do we make conditions better, to being able to open up conversation and really push back on a lot of really important voices in the broader movement to say the conversation we're having is not the right one. And we need to have a broader conversation about what does it look like for fighting for full liberation for people, and what does that mean, and who are we excluding with our current tactics. DWN plays a huge role in the national landscape, both pushing the conversation at the federal level and also supporting local organizing. So I just want to say everyone here in this room is a part of the next success story we have that's going to follow in the lineage of what Silky just shared in New Jersey. So if you've been thinking about your $10, your $17, your $250, just know that that work is happening right now. There's another place right now that is engaged in exactly the fight that you're laying out, and DWN is helping make sure that we win at the end of the day. So with that, does anybody have a question for Silky? I see a green jacket on the left.
Hi, my name is Evelyn. First off, happy Medicare Month. And my question, Silky, is how do you approach different types of abolition work in different demographics? Like New York, really accessible to immigrants, but New Jersey, you have to drive everywhere and everyone has a license. So how do you kind of approach different communities and communities that you're not part of personally?
Yeah, I mean, we work with groups on the ground in 20 plus states, and so often we're working alongside people who are in that community and trying to just support them and figure out what they need. And oftentimes what we do is try to find similar scenarios. So like people in Illinois talking to folks in New Jersey or California or Washington State versus folks in Texas talking to people in Georgia and Florida. Like, that is a lot of how the work happens, is like we learn from each other. And I think one thing that, has helped our ability to sort of throw a wrench in ICE's plans is because everyone sort of has, they might have different state level or city level targets or county level targets, but there's still these particular types of relationships with ICE. So whether there's an intergovernmental service agreement, which means essentially a contract between ICE and a county jail, or if there is, different ICE police collaborations, many localities are actually dealing with similar things and then sort of learning from each other the different ways to throw a wrench in it, the different ways to sort of push back on it. And so that's kind of often how we do it. I think one of the challenges, and I write about this a little bit in the book, is that, for instance, the Hudson County Jail remains open. People continue to be detained there, not necessarily for ICE, but for other entities, maybe other counties. And I think one of our big challenges right now is that there's sort of these unintended consequences when you have some wins where, people are still dependent on the jobs, people are still dependent on the facility being there and finding ways to transition out of those economies. And I think that's a bigger conversation, but the reason why it's so important that we bridge across movement and for people who are doing anti-jail work along with people who are doing work against the immigrant detention system. Thank you for the question.
And there's some great examples in the book, I think especially the work in Illinois, talking about how organizers made connections with other folks organizing in rural communities about the sustained disinvestment from rural communities that makes people inclined to be dependent on something like the prison economy. So I think there's tons of great intersectional connections to check out. Okay, Silky, can I just ask, while we're going to do another round of questions, but I just have one that I might just throw out there to make sure we get your thoughts. Since you wrote the book, which was not that long ago, and yet time flies, is there anything that you're seeing right now that, given what we've been talking about and the themes you highlight in the book, that you think are important for us to keep an eye out for or to be aware of, just with where the discourse is right now and the kind of what's in the headlines?
It's been a really surreal summer putting this book out. It's been wild to see how far to the right things have moved. I think one thing I would keep in mind, and I write a little bit about this program in Texas called Operation Lone Star. So much of my book is making the case these systems are intertwined, they're racist, there's all these problems, but so much of this is related to political economy, which is what I was just talking about. And, you see that with the scheme that Greg Abbott, governor of my home state, who's essentially dictating immigration policy for the whole country right now, both through all these lawsuits against any sort of positive reforms, but also through the busing of migrants to, here in DC, in New York City, in Chicago, bringing the border to the sanctuary cities. Because there's been all these weakened social safety nets, after, with the pandemic, and in so many ways, actually 10 years ago, certain places could accept this number of migrants and not be as much of an issue. But in this moment, there's so much, there's a housing crisis. There's all these other things happening. Liberals have basically fallen into the trap. They've sort of accepted the frame that the border is a problem. Oh, we get the border now because Greg Abbott brought it to us. And that's why we've seen this movement more and more to the right. But again, it's about those sort of bigger questions about political economy. And even in Texas with Operation Lone Star, I write about this, but it's this program that, in every way you see it changing the local economies and localities saying, yeah, we actually want Operation Lone Star. We were on this witness tour and we crossed from Eagle Pass into Piedras Negras with these End Operation Lone Star shirts. And the woman at the border was like, we want, and this is something that Greg Abbott has poured billions of dollars into, essentially commandeering the state criminal legal system to prosecute migrants. And they're like, well, we want to keep it because it's bringing money to our town. We're a poor town. And so much of this is about these bigger questions on the political economy of these systems, about the carceral economy, and then also about the investments that we're making, these questions of what do we divest from, what do we invest in, what do people need? And I think in this moment when things are so heightened and so blatantly racist and awful, turning back to that framework of the collective of like, we're all in this together, how do we make the whole pie bigger, how do we actually think about abundance instead of the scarcity mindset, I think is going to be really important.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay, so we have time for one more question and then we'll wrap up. And yeah, okay, hi.
Hi. Thank you for writing the book. I think this is part 1, part 2, part 3. Immigrant. My mom brought us here in 1966. I'm not going to tell you here. I'm from Panama, Central America.
I can't hear.
And therefore, I'm African Black American. And so, there is Black people everywhere. And when we came to America, there was a process. We had to get papers, we had to get sponsors. My aunt had to have $20,000, $50,000 in the bank, so forth and so on. And so there was a way that it was done to come to the country. However, as you stated, connecting the dots, if America would leave other people's countries alone, i.e. Brazil, i.e. Venezuela, Honduras, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and allow them to do business and run their country, the main culprit and enemy is the International Monetary Fund. And that's a whole nother story.
Yeah.
However, what I am really angry about is the way that when the Cubans are trying to come from Cuba into Miami, the boat capsizes, they're sent back when the Haitians, and mind you now, the problem in Haiti is an American problem.
Absolutely.
They created the disruption because they want the minerals and resources to make a little electric car, trunk car, sorry. So, and that's a whole nother story. See, there's story after story after story, and you have to read, and you have to do your homework. And someone needs to write the book about why are we Black people being mistreated and treated differently when we all, as you said, collective community want the same thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that comment. I mean, I think, like, yeah, absolutely. Like, there's, you know, I start out the book with the, I mean, in this period of time and what we know of the modern detention system, which really started in the early 1980s. And this is, you know, this is one of the ways the systems are intertwined. Their roots trace back to anti-Black racism. It was a response to Haitian migrants coming to the U.S. in the early 1980s that were deemed economic migrants because the U.S. was backing the dictatorship then. And they were systematically detained. And people, you know, and they were protesting their conditions, and people like Reverend Jesse Jackson was like, hey, what are you doing? And all these people were like, this is racist, you're doing this to Black migrants. And people were suing, and their response was like, instead of releasing Haitians, they actually said, well, we're gonna apply this more broadly. And so then it became, let's detain Central Americans who are also fleeing US-backed wars in the region. And that's how we start to see the rise of detention. And so I think absolutely that is like one of my biggest goals with the book, is that this is about anti-Black racism, and so many of the frames around criminalization and all the other things that are out there, and obviously imperialism, are sort of essential for us to understand if we're going to get to a better place. So thank you so much for your question, or for the comment.
Okay, I have one more question. Do we have any other folks in the audience? Okay, I have one last question for you, Silky, as we're closing. Something that I thought was really special for me getting to read the book was, obviously there's a lot of lows, some of which are still our current lows, but there's a lot of highs to celebrate when we think about those moments where we have broken out of some of these discourses and systems that have really been constraining our organizing. So talking about the successes with banning detention in different states, the Not One More campaign, the success of the immigrant youth movement. And I loved when you shared about some of the work that you've done with descendants of families who were interned during World War II. And I wonder if, for me being able to sustain myself in the work, and I think this is perhaps something that other folks might relate to, sometimes being able to put ourselves in that broader, longer context and remember that we're part of a longer arc is what helps me hold the whole when it doesn't seem like there's any win in sight, and it seems like we're on a very long, dark road, potentially rehashing things that we thought we already won. And so I wonder if there's any thoughts that you have for us, in the months and years to come, regardless of what outcomes we have later this year. Your book lays out some really substantial obstacles that we're going to have either way to really move towards a different vision for immigrant communities and for real freedom in the work that we do. And so I wonder if you could share something that helps ground and sustain you in that larger arc, knowing all the challenges that we still have to tackle.
Yeah, I think in so many ways writing this book was both helpful to process, but also really humbling, and just witnessing how much incredible work has happened over the years. And I think about the 1990s and what was happening in California with Proposition 187 and the shift that we saw in California over time. I think about the work that's happened in Arizona around SB 1070, of course, the 2006 marches. I think about what we were able to do to actually shift the conversation to get people to believe in an end to detention, which we really did get a lot of the mainstream immigrant rights movement, and even some politicians. Secretary Mayorkas even said, there's an overuse of detention, and that was because of the work of our communities, of our members, of this movement. And so I hold on to that. I do think we're in for a long haul fight right now. I think it's going to be a really hard time for some time, and so I think holding on to those wins and doing that sort of spade work, that steady work to bring people in so that we're ready for those moments like in 2020 where we have some openings. And so I think that's what I'm trying to hold on to right now.
Y'all, let's give it up for Silky.
Thank you.